There is a document sitting in the archive of ancient history that was never meant to help Christianity. It was written by a man who thought Christians were criminals. He was a Roman senator, a historian of the empire, a man whose entire career was built on recording what actually happened, not what believers wished had happened, not what priests wanted preserved, but what the machinery of Roman power actually did to actual people in actual places. And in the year 116 of the Common Era, he sat down and wrote a sentence about an execution. He did not write it to support anyone's faith. He wrote it because it was a fact. But that document is not the one we are here for today. There is another text, older than the senator's history, written by a Jewish historian who had complicated, painful reasons to keep his distance from anything associated with the figure of Jesus of Nazareth. A man who had survived a war, switched sides, and spent the rest of his life writing for the people who had conquered his country. He was careful. He was precise. He chose every word deliberately. And inside his history, buried in a sentence about the execution of a man named James, there is a single Greek word that nobody talks about, a word that functions as doubt, a word that Josephus chose carefully and that he never changed, a word that 2,000 years later tells you exactly what he was trying not to say, a word designed to create distance between the historian and the claim. And that word, that small, careful, skeptical particle of Greek, is perhaps the strongest linguistic fingerprint preserved in any non-Christian source from the ancient world. Not what the word says, what it refuses to say. That is what we are going to find today. Not through theology, not through faith, through the documents written by people who had every reason to look the other way, and couldn't. To understand what these documents mean, you have to understand who wrote them. The first is Publius Cornelius Tacitus. Tacitus was not a friend of Christians. He was a Roman aristocrat, a senator, a consul, a man who moved through the highest levels of imperial power. He lived through the reigns of emperors, watched Rome burn, witnessed the collapse of dynasties, and he wrote about all of it with the cold precision of someone who believed that history was a record of power, and that sentiment had no place in that record. Around 116 of the Common Era, he completed the Annals, a history of Rome covering the century that had just passed. And in the 15th book, while describing the Emperor Nero's attempt to blame Christians for the Great Fire of Rome, Tacitus paused. He needed to explain who Christians were. He called Christianity an excitabilis superstitio, a destructive superstition. He said it had originated in Judea, that it had been temporarily suppressed, that it had then broken out again, his words, and spread to Rome, where it gathered what he called all things horrible and shameful. He was not complimenting it. He was recording its existence the way a physician records a disease, with facts without affection, with barely concealed contempt. And then he wrote the sentence that matters. The founder of this superstition, he said, had suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, at the hands of one of Rome's procurators, a man named Pontius Pilatus. That is all he says about Jesus. No miracles, no resurrection, no theology. Just, he was executed by Pilate under Tiberius. The second figure is Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus. History calls him Pliny the Younger. Pliny was a lawyer and a magistrate who eventually became governor of a Roman province in what is now northern Turkey. Around the year 112, he wrote a letter to the Emperor Trajan asking for instructions on what to do about Christians in his province. He was not writing out of curiosity. He was writing because they were becoming an administrative problem. He had been arresting them, interrogating them. Some had recanted their faith years earlier to avoid punishment. He needed to know, did old recantations count or only recent ones? In that letter, Pliny described their practices in detail, the way bureaucrats describe problems they need guidance on. They gathered before dawn, he wrote. They sang hymns. They took oaths not to commit crimes. And they sang those hymns, he noted as a specific detail, to Christ quasi Deo, as to a god. Pliny had no reason to invent this. He was filing a report. What he wrote was what his investigators had found. The third figure is the one who gives us the word. His name was Titus Flavius Josephus, and his position was the most complicated of all. Josephus was a Jewish military commander who had surrendered to Rome during the Great Jewish Revolt of 66 to 73 of the Common Era. He had survived by telling the Roman general Vespasian that he would become emperor. The prediction came true, and Josephus spent the rest of his life in Rome writing histories of the Jewish people for a Roman audience, under Roman patronage, walking a permanent tightrope between his heritage and his survival. He was a Pharisee. He believed in the God of Israel. He was not going to call anyone the Messiah. He had no motivation to help Christianity. The last thing he wanted was to draw favorable attention to one of its central figures. He was the most hostile witness of the three. And that is precisely why what he wrote matters more than anything Tacitus or Pliny ever put down. In 1961, an Italian archaeological team was excavating the remains of a Roman theater in the ancient port city of Caesarea Maritima, on the coast of what is now Israel. They were moving through layers of stone methodically, cataloging everything, when one of the team turned over a block that had been reused as a step in a later renovation. Someone, centuries after the original construction, had flipped a carved stone upside down and used it as building material. On the face of that stone, the face that had been pressed against the ground, they found an inscription. Partially damaged, several letters missing, but enough remained. The name Pontius Pilatus, the title Praefectus Iudaeae, Prefect of Judea. Before that stone was found, there were serious scholars who argued that Pilate was a literary construct, a convenient Roman official invented or embellished by the Gospel writers to add historical texture to the crucifixion narrative. The Roman administrative records from the period were incomplete. No independent source had named him directly in physical form. The stone named him directly. It is now in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. You can stand in front of it. A limestone block, roughly the size of a large suitcase, with Latin letters carved by a craftsman who had no idea that 2,000 years later people would be arguing about the man whose name he was inscribing. Pilate was real. The prefecture was real. The administrative machinery of Roman Judea, which processed criminals with bureaucratic precision, which recorded names and charges and sentences, had existed exactly where the texts said it existed. But here is something that does not get the attention it deserves. When Tacitus describes the execution of Jesus, he calls Pilate a procurator, a financial administrator, a different title than what the Caesarea stone says. The stone says Praefectus, a military prefect, a higher rank with different authority. This looks like an error. It is. Tacitus got the title wrong, and that error is one of the strongest arguments for the authenticity of his account, because it tells you something important about how Tacitus was working. He was not copying from an official Roman document. He did not have access to the exact administrative records of first-century Judea. He was writing from what was generally known about the period, from memory, from sources, from the accumulated knowledge that had circulated through Roman literary and official circles for 8 decades. He got the title wrong because he was working from imperfect information. But he got everything else right: the name, the execution, the emperor, the province. Because those things were simply known. They were not stored in a filing cabinet that Tacitus happened to consult. They were part of what educated Romans knew about a movement that had grown in the space of 80 years, from a small group of followers in Judea to a community large enough to require an imperial governor, to write to the emperor for instructions on how to manage it. You do not need perfect records to know that something happened. You need witnesses. You need time. You need the kind of knowledge that spreads through a society and becomes, after a generation, simply what people know. Tacitus knew it, Pliny knew it, and Josephus, careful, politically cautious, professionally careful, Josephus knew it too. And here is where it gets extraordinary. In his Antiquities of the Jews, written in the early 90s of the Common Era, Josephus is describing the illegal execution of a man named James, the leader of the Jerusalem church, put to death by the high priest Ananus during a brief gap in Roman governance. He needs to identify which James he means. There were many men named James in Jerusalem. It was a common name. So Josephus does what historians do. He identifies the man by his most recognizable connection. He writes 6 words of Greek: ton adelphon Iesu tou legomenou Christo, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. 6 words, recorded in the early 90s, copied by scribes across centuries, debated by scholars for generations. And at the center of those 6 words is a single particle that changes everything. Legomenou. It comes from the Greek verb lego, to say, to call, to name. In this form it means the one called, or who was said to be, or in its most skeptical reading, the so-called. Josephus is not saying Jesus is the Christ. He is saying this is the man his followers call by that name. This is the title they have given him. I, Josephus, am simply using that designation to identify him, because that is how you will recognize who I mean. It is the language of a journalist, not a believer. It is deliberate distance. It is exactly the phrase you would use if you were a first-century Jewish historian who needed to reference a figure you did not accept as messianic, but whose followers had already spread that title far enough that it served as identification. That word, legomenou, is the fingerprint of the original text, because here is what a forger would have written. A Christian scribe in the 4th or 5th century, someone motivated to insert a favorable reference to Jesus into a prestigious Jewish source, would never have written the so-called Christ. They would have written Jesus who is the Christ, or Jesus our Lord, any phrase that signals belief rather than distance. No one who wanted to make Jesus look good writes legomenou. The skepticism is the signature of authenticity. The doubt is the proof. That single word survived 2,000 years of manuscript copying. It survived the centuries when Christian monks were the primary copyists and custodians of ancient texts. It survived every moment when a scribe with a strong enough motive could have changed it. It survived because it was there from the beginning, because it was what Josephus actually wrote, and because even the most devoted copyist recognized that changing the grammar of an ancient authority was a line they could not cross. If you are watching this channel for the first time, and this is the kind of investigation you have been looking for, subscribe now. We go deeper into these texts every single week. And there is more coming in this episode. Legomenou does something else. It tells us that by the early 90s of the Common Era, the title Christ, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Mashiach, the Anointed One, was already so firmly attached to Jesus that it functioned as a proper identifier. Josephus is not explaining the term. He is not defining it. He uses it the way you use a well-known name, assuming his audience will understand the reference. You do not use a nickname to identify someone unless the nickname is already widely known. Josephus, writing for a Roman audience in the early 90s, for readers who had no particular investment in Jewish messianic categories, uses Christ as if everyone knows what it means and who it refers to. Which means it did, which means the movement had already spread far enough, and the name had already stuck firmly enough, that a skeptical Jewish historian could use it as shorthand, without explanation, without apology, and trust that his readers would follow. That is not what myth looks like 60 years after an event. That is what history looks like. There is something in these three sources that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Tacitus, Pliny, and Josephus all write about Jesus or Christians without once questioning whether Jesus actually existed. Think about what that means. The early opponents of Christianity argued about almost everything. They argued that Jesus had learned magic in Egypt, that his birth was illegitimate, that his disciples had stolen the body to fake a resurrection, that his followers were credulous, antisocial, and dangerous. They argued about what Jesus was. Nobody argued about whether he was. Celsus, the 2nd century Greek philosopher who wrote the most systematic pagan critique of Christianity that survives, did not say Jesus was a myth. He said Jesus was a man born of a poor Jewish woman. He called Jesus a sorcerer who had learned tricks in Egypt. He disputed the virgin birth, the miracles, the resurrection. He engaged with Jesus as a historical figure whose story needed to be debunked, not a fictional character who had never existed. That is a crucial distinction. When ancient writers wanted to dismiss a figure as mythological, they said so directly. They had the vocabulary for it. They could tell the difference between a legend and a historical claim. What they did with Jesus was different. They challenged the interpretation. They disputed the significance. They argued about his nature, his powers, his origins, his followers. But they placed him in history, in Judea, under Roman rule, in the time of Tiberius, because that is where he was. Tacitus thought Christians were criminals following a superstition. He still recorded the execution. Because it happened, Pliny thought Christians were an administrative nuisance. He never questioned whether the figure they were singing to had been a real person, because that question apparently did not need asking. Josephus kept his distance. He wrote legomenou, so-called, and moved on to the next paragraph. But he wrote the name, in a history meant to last, in a document he knew would be read by Romans, by Jews, by everyone he needed to impress. He wrote the name, and he placed it in the same world that Tacitus described, the same world that the Caesarea stone confirms, the same world that Pliny was trying to manage from a provincial governor's office in northern Turkey. Something happened in Jerusalem in the spring of that year. The people who wished it hadn't are the clearest proof that it did. We began with a word inside a document, a word that functions as doubt. Legomenou, the so-called, the one called, the one his followers named, but whom I, Josephus, historian of the Jewish people, servant of Rome, am not naming that way. That word survived because it was never changed. And it was never changed because no one who read it thought they had the authority to smooth out what Josephus actually wrote. The skepticism was the original text. The distance was the original text. The careful, deliberate refusal to say Christ without a qualifier was the original text. And in that refusal, in that thin margin of doubt that Josephus left between himself and the claim, we find something that no statement of faith could have preserved. The signature of a man who did not believe, writing the name of a man he could not ignore. This video was made possible by you. Every episode takes many hours of research, digging through archaeological records, ancient manuscripts, and sources most people never see. If you want to support this work and go deeper, you can join the hidden archives on our membership page. Members get access to the full research behind every episode, the sources, the original texts, the details that don't fit in a 20-minute video. It is the unseen layer beneath the unseen Bible. But please, don't feel obligated. Watching this video, leaving a comment, sharing it with someone, that already matters more than you know. We are grateful you are here. The next episode goes somewhere older than Rome, older than Josephus, back to the beginning of Genesis, to 4 verses that most pastors skip entirely, and a Hebrew word that your Bible has been translating incorrectly for over 2,000 years. The word is not what you think it means, and when you understand what it actually says, what the writers of the original Hebrew actually meant, what the Greek translators did to it 2 centuries before Christ, and what the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm, the passage becomes something your Sunday school never prepared you for. That is next.